Hey guys, tonight we're not just easing into sleep. We're tiptoeing back in time to an era where royalty was less about fairy tale castles and more about constant, nerve-wracking drama. We're diving into a historical cold case so captivating. It makes modern true crime podcasts look like a walk in the park. Tonight, Yuri's stepping into the muddy boots of 15th century England, a place where checking into the Tower of London might just be a one-way trip for a couple of unsuspecting princes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, if you will, the year is roughly 1455. You're living in England, and let me tell you, it's less merry old England and more oh God. Who's king today? Old habits die hard. But so do old families, and two of them, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, are absolutely duking it out for the throne. Forget your typical family squabbles over who gets the last slice of pizza. This was a fight over who got to wear the fanciest hat and sit on the most uncomfortable chair in the kingdom. Each house had a symbolic rose red for Lancaster, white for York, hence the rather poetic, yet incredibly violent name the Wars of the Roses. You wake up most mornings to the distant sound of church bells, but also the constant, low hum of uncertainty. Whose banner is flying over the local lord's castle today? Are the roads safe for travel? Or will you run into a band of disgruntled soldiers looking for trouble, or, worse, supplies? You might be a farmer tilling your fields, your back aching, or a merchant trying to keep your goods safe on treacherous roads. Perhaps you're even a lowly servant in a noble household, constantly on edge, listening for whispers of new allegiances or betrayals. The air is thick with ambition, suspicion, and the very real threat of sudden, brutal violence. It's like living inside a really long, very bloody episode of a historical drama, except there's no remote control to change the channel. This isn't just some distant squabble among the elite. It affects you. Taxes are levied, soldiers are recruited from your village, and trade routes become dangerous. One day, your lord might be pledging fealty to King Henry VI of the House of Lancaster. The next, he might be subtly shifting his allegiance to Richard, Duke of York. And you, dear viewer, are just trying to keep your head down and avoid getting caught in the crossfire. It's like being a fan of two rival sports teams, but if your team lost, you got decapitated. Okay, maybe a slight exaggeration, but only slight. Historians still debate the precise starting point of this whole mess. Was it the First Battle of Street Albans in 1455, when the Duke of York basically ambushed the king's forces, or did the seeds of discord go back even further, to the deposing of Richard II by Henry IV Lancaster way back in 1399? It's a historical chicken and egg situation, really, but the bottom line is that by the mid-15th century, England was a hotbed of political instability, fueled by a weak king, ambitious nobles, and a whole lot of bad blood. And speaking of bad blood, here's a quirky little detail you might not know during these wars. It wasn't just armies clashing. Sometimes, powerful nobles would literally switch sides mid-battle if they saw an advantage, or if their current side seemed to be losing. Imagine playing chess, but your pieces occasionally decide to join the other side's army if they think it'll lead to a better outcome for them personally. Loyalty was a flexible concept, often secondary to personal gain or survival. This constant shifting of allegiances made the political landscape a dizzying maze of alliances and betrayals, making it incredibly difficult to know who to trust. You'd probably keep a very close eye on your neighbors, just in case they suddenly decided to declare themselves for the other roles. So, you're navigating this volatile world. You hear tales of battles like the WTO, one of the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, where tens of thousands perished in a single day. You hear whispers of madness afflicting King Henry VI, leaving a power vacuum that ambitious lords were all too eager to fill. You see the white rose banners of the Yorkists rise, only to be challenged again by the red rose of the Lancastrianess. This wasn't just a political struggle. It was a deeply personal feud between powerful families, passed down through generations, making any semblance of long-term peace seem almost impossible. And it's into this incredibly messy, unpredictable, and frankly quite terrifying period that our story's central characters, two young princes, are about to be born. They're coming into a world where their birthright is less a golden ticket and more a bullseye on their back. Good luck, little ones. You're still breathing the uneasy air of 15th century England. Though for a brief, shining period, things actually started to look up. After years of brutal fighting in the Wars of the Roses, the new, charismatic king finally emerged, Edward IV. Imagine a strapping, handsome, and incredibly tall man. Edward stood at least 6'4", which was practically a giant in his era. He was from the House of York, and he managed to win the throne, effectively pushing out the Lancastrian King Henry VI, who, bless his heart, was often more interested in praying than ruling. Edward wasn't just a pretty face. He was a formidable warrior and a shrewd politician. He was the kind of king who could lead his army on the battlefield and then charmingly negotiate peace treaties. Under his reign, after so much bloodshed, England finally experienced a period of relative stability and prosperity. Trade began to flourish again, and people could actually go about their lives without constantly worrying about being conscripted or seeing their villages burned down. For you, the everyday person, this meant a sigh of relief. Maybe, just maybe, you could finally plant your crops without fear, or open your shop without anticipating a sudden, violent interruption. It was like the sun finally broke through after a very, very long storm. He had a controversial, yet undeniably romantic, marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. Now, this was a big deal. Most kings married foreign princesses for political alliances. But Edward, being Edward, secretly married a commoner, well, a knight's widow, but still, not royal blood. Imagine the gasps in the court. This caused a massive stir and alienated some of his most powerful allies, particularly his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, who felt deeply insulted by this unexpected union. It was like your favorite celebrity suddenly eloping with someone completely outside the usual glamorous circles, a juicy scandal that rocked the nobility. Despite the initial uproar, the marriage produced many children, securing the York ISD line, or so everyone thought. Among them were two sons, Edward V, born in 1470, and Richard, Duke of York, born in 1473. These two boys, innocent and oblivious to the cutthroat world they inhabited, were the very core of Edward IV's legacy. They were the future, the promise of continued peace under the House of York. You might have seen them, as young boys, perhaps riding in a carriage through London, or catching a glimpse of them playing in the royal gardens, completely unaware of the immense weight of expectation and danger that rested upon their tiny shoulders. Everything seemed to be going well. Edward IV was firmly on his throne. His family was growing, and England was relatively calm. But then, as often happens in these stories, tragedy struck, swiftly and unexpectedly. In April 1483, Edward IV fell ill. What exactly struck him down is still a matter of historical debate. Some historians point to pneumonia, others to an old battle wound that had festered, or even a stroke. There are even whispers of more sinister causes, though no concrete evidence supports them. It's one of those tantalizing historical what-ifs that keeps academics scratching their heads. Was it a natural illness, or was there something more at play? We'll likely never know for sure, which only adds to the mystery that is about to unfold. His health deteriorated rapidly. You can imagine the frantic whispers in the royal court, the hurried footsteps of physicians, the palpable fear among the courtiers. The king, This towering, robust figure who had brought stability back to England was suddenly fading. The news would have spread like wildfire, carried by nervous messengers on horseback through the towns and villages. The sigh of relief that had settled over the land after the Wars of the Roses would have caught in people's throats. The king is ill. Then, the king is dying. And finally, the terrible, kingdom-shaking news: the king is dead. Edward IV passed away on April 9, 1918, at the relatively young age of 40. His death was a massive shock. It was completely unexpected, especially after such a long and stable reign. Imagine the collective gasp across England. One moment, you have a strong, reigning king. The next, the future is suddenly uncertain, resting on the shoulders of a very young boy. For the common folk, this meant a return to anxiety. The fragile peace Edward had built suddenly seemed incredibly precarious. The old rivalries, which had been simmering beneath the surface, were poised to erupt once more. And here's a rather grim, quirky detail about royal deaths during this period: the process of embalming and displaying the body was often a very public and drawn-out affair. It was meant to confirm the death and solidify the succession, but it must have been a rather unsettling spectacle. Imagine seeing your once vibrant king lying in state, rigid and still. It was a stark reminder of mortality, even for the most powerful rulers, and a visual representation of the immense power vacuum that had just been created. With Edward IV gone, the stage was now set for the next act of this historical drama. His eldest son, also named Edward, was just 12 years old, a child king, and in a political landscape as cutthroat as 15th century England, a child on the throne was less a sign of innocent continuity and more an open invitation for ambitious relatives to step in and help, often to their own considerable advantage. The sudden death of Edward IV was not just a personal tragedy for his family. It was the trigger for one of history's most enduring and unsettling cold cases. The two young princes, now orphaned and vulnerable, were about to find their lives, and ultimately their very existence, thrown into the most perilous of situations. The peace was over. The game, as it were, had truly begun. You're now looking at the heart of the matter, the very foundation of our mystery: two young boys, suddenly thrust into the blinding spotlight of the English throne. The elder, Edward, was just 12 years old when his powerful father, King Edward IV, unexpectedly died. Imagine being 12 and suddenly being told you're the most important person in the country, the rightful heir to a kingdom still recovering from decades of brutal civil war. It's a weight no child should ever have to bear. Young Edward was officially styled Edward V. He was described as a bright, intelligent boy, having received a rigorous education fit for a future king. He had been living at Ludlow Castle in Wales, away from the immediate political intrigues of London, under the tutelage of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. This was a common practice. Young heirs were often raised away from court to be shaped and protected, learning the ropes of kingship in a more controlled environment. He probably spent his days studying Latin, practicing horsemanship, and dreaming of the day he would truly rule. You can almost picture him, earnest and perhaps a little overwhelmed, trying to grasp the enormity of his new destiny. His younger brother was Richard, Duke of York. He was only 10 years old at the time of their father's death. Richard was likely a typical energetic younger brother, perhaps looking up to his older, more serious sibling. He might have been a bit mischievous, or perhaps quieter, trying to keep up with the demands placed on a royal prince. While Edward V was the direct heir, Richard was next in line, a crucial spare, a safety net for the royal succession. In the turbulent world of the 15th century, having a second son was not just a blessing for the family. It was a matter of national security. Both boys were illegitimate, born of King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and their place in the line of succession was, by all conventional standards, absolutely clear. Their position was enviable, yet incredibly precarious. They represented the continuation of the York IST line, the promise of stability after the chaotic Wars of the Roses. For many, they were the embodiment of England's future. However, for others, particularly those with their own ambitions, they were merely obstacles. A child king, no matter how intelligent, is inherently weak in the eyes of powerful, adult nobles. They can be manipulated, influenced, or, as we're about to see, perhaps even removed. Here's a somewhat strange, but important, historical detail about the Woodville family. The Queen's relatives, they were incredibly ambitious and had rapidly risen to prominence during Edward Iver's reign due to the Queen's influence. This made them highly unpopular with the older, established nobility, who viewed them as upstarts who had gained too much power and wealth too quickly. Imagine a new family suddenly arriving in town and, seemingly overnight, taking over all the important positions and building the biggest mansion. There would be a lot of resentment and whispers, right? This widespread animosity towards the Woodvilles meant that when King Edward IV died, many powerful figures were just waiting for an opportunity to curb their influence. This resentment is a key piece of the puzzle, as it heavily influenced the events that followed. So you have these two innocent boys, full of life, completely unaware of the political storm brewing around them. They were the center of a kingdom's hope, yet also the focus of immense danger. The younger Edward was preparing to travel from Ludlow to London to be crowned king, a journey that should have been a triumphant procession. His brother, Richard, was likely awaiting his arrival in the capital, ready to witness his brother's grand coronation. Historians still debate what their personalities were truly like, given their young age and the limited, often biased, accounts of the time. Were they sensitive or strong-willed, playful or studious? We can only imagine, projecting onto them the innocence of childhood, knowing the dark fate that may have awaited them. This lack of detailed personal insight only adds to the tragic nature of their story. They become figures of history, rather than fully fleshed-out individuals, lost in the mists of time. They were the legal, undisputed heirs. There was no question of their legitimacy at this point. Their father had been a popular king, and their mother, though controversial, was his queen. You might have seen their portraits, which depict them as typical boys of their age, dressed in fine clothes, perhaps with an air of solemnity fitting their royal status. But behind those innocent eyes lay a destiny that was about to take a very dark and unexpected turn. Their status as the lawful heirs was about to be challenged in the most brutal and cynical way imaginable, all stemming from the ambition of one very powerful man. The stage is set, the main characters are in place, and the curtain is about to rise on a true historical tragedy. You're now looking at the person who would become the central figure in this unfolding tragedy, the man whose name is forever entwined with the mystery of the Princess Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He was the youngest brother of the recently deceased King Edward IV, and therefore the uncle of the young Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. Imagine Richard. Historical accounts paint a picture of a man who was reportedly devout, loyal to his brother Edward IV, and an accomplished military commander. He had a reputation for bravery and administrative competence. During Edward IV's reign, Richard had been entrusted with significant responsibilities, particularly in the north of England, where he managed to secure the borders against Scotland and maintain order. He was seen as a pillar of the York IST regime, a man of action and loyalty. You might have heard tales of his prowess in battle, or seen him ride through a town with his retinue, a stern but commanding figure. However, after Edward Iver's sudden death, Richard's role dramatically shifted. He went from being a powerful duke and loyal brother to becoming the Lord Protector of England. This meant he was effectively in charge of the country, responsible for guiding the young King Edward V until he came of age. This position was immense. It granted him almost unlimited power and influence during the interregnum, the period between the old king's death and the new king's coronation. It was a golden opportunity for someone ambitious, or Some might argue, a heavy burden for someone truly dedicated to upholding the legitimate succession. The problem, as you might recall, was the Woodville family, Queen Elizabeth's relatives. They had gained immense power and wealth under Edward IV, and many of the older, established noble families, including Richard, deeply resented their rapid rise. There was a palpable tension between the old guard and the new money or new power of the Woodvilles. Richard, along with figures like the Duke of Buckingham, believed the Woodvilles were too ambitious and posed a threat to the stability of the kingdom, especially with a child king on the throne. They feared the Woodvilles would dominate the young Edward V, marginalizing the traditional nobility and seizing even more control. So when news of Edward I's death reached Richard, who was in the north, he immediately began to move south. He met young King Edward V's entourage, which included the king's maternal uncle, Earl Rivers, at Stony Stratford. What happened next was a swift and decisive move that stunned the kingdom. Richard, along with his ally Buckingham, arrested Earl Rivers and other prominent Woodville family members, accusing them of plotting against the new Lord Protector. This was a direct challenge to the Queen's power and a bold power play. You can almost feel the shockwaves traveling across the country as news of these arrests spread. It was a clear signal that Richard was not going to be a passive regent. This move was justified by Richard and his supporters as necessary to free the young king from the alleged undue influence of the Woodvilles. They painted the Woodvilles as dangerous conspirators, greedy and power-hungry. It's a classic political maneuver, isn't it? Discredit your opponents, isolate the key figure, and then step in as the savior. Whether Richard genuinely believed this or was simply using it as a pretext for his own ambitions is a question that historians have debated for centuries. Was he truly acting to protect the young king and the kingdom? Or was this the very first calculated step in a much grander, more sinister plan? Here's a curious little detail. Some contemporary accounts suggest that Richard himself was initially hesitant to take on the role of Lord Protector, or at least he appeared to be. He apparently needed some convincing from his allies, particularly the Duke of Buckingham, to assume such a central position of power. Now, whether this was genuine humility, shrewd political theater to appear reluctant, or just typical human indecision in the face of immense responsibility, we'll never truly know. But it adds another layer to his complex character. Was he a reluctant usurper or a cunning manipulator playing a long game? Regardless of his true intentions, Richard's actions at Stony Stratford effectively decapitated the Woodville faction and consolidated his own power. He seized control of the young king's person, which was an absolutely crucial step. In medieval England, possessing the king was equivalent to possessing the ultimate symbol of authority. Without the king, even if he was a child, you had no legitimate claim to rule. Richard then began his journey to London with his nephew, Edward V, now effectively under his control. The city was abuzz of anticipation and apprehension. People whispered about the arrests, about Richard's sudden and decisive actions. Many hoped for stability, but others must have felt a growing sense of unease. The man who was supposed to be the young king's protector was now undeniably the most powerful figure in the kingdom, with seemingly unchecked authority. And as you'll soon see, with this power came a dangerous proximity to the very throne he was sworn to protect. The pieces were now falling into place for the dramatic events that would follow, all orchestrated by the man who started as the young king's guardian. You're watching as young King Edward V makes his way towards London, a procession that should have been a triumphant arrival, but instead carries an undeniable undertone of apprehension. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is riding by his side, ostensibly as his protector. But after the dramatic arrests of the Woodville faction at Stony Stratford, the air is thick with suspicion. The common folk, including you, might have lined the streets, curious and perhaps a little fearful. You'd see the royal standard, the heralds, the retinue of soldiers, but beneath the plum, a chilling reality was taking hold. The young king was now entirely in his uncle's hands. And then, The moment arrived. Edward V, the rightful heir to the English throne, was brought to the Tower of London. Now, before you jump to conclusions, the Tower wasn't just a prison. It was also a royal palace, a secure fortress, a treasury, and an armory. Many monarchs stayed there before their coronation, as it offered safety and convenience in the heart of the capital. So, on the surface, this wasn't inherently sinister. Richard explained that it was for the young king's protection while preparations for his coronation were finalized. However, the circumstances were different. Edward V was effectively isolated from his mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and his remaining loyal supporters. He was being held in a royal residence, yes, but it was also a place notorious for holding political prisoners and, occasionally, for witnessing their quiet disappearances. It was like being invited to stay in a very fancy, very secure hotel, but then realizing you can't actually leave, and all your friends have suddenly gone missing. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, understandably terrified by the arrest of her brother and the isolation of her son, immediately took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her other children, including her younger son, Richard, Duke of York. Sanctuary was a medieval legal concept where individuals could seek refuge in a church or abbey, and for a certain period, they were protected from arrest. It was a desperate act, signaling her profound fear for her family's safety. Imagine the Queen, stripped of her power, rushing into a church, her heart pounding, clutching her remaining children close. It was a stark image of vulnerability. Meanwhile, Richard, the Lord Protector, was consolidating his power in London. He dismissed officials loyal to the Woodvilles and appointed his own men to key positions. The coronation of Edward V was repeatedly postponed, initially for preparations, then for less clear reasons. Each delay chipped away at the young king's authority and bolstered Richard's. It was a slow, deliberate tightening of the screws, making it increasingly clear who was truly in charge. Here's a somewhat morbidly fascinating detail about the Tower of London during this period beneath its grand exterior. It was a place steeped in dark history, though not yet the primary execution site it would become. It had already seen its share of prominent prisoners and quiet deaths. The White Tower, the central keep, where the princes were likely housed, was designed to be virtually impenetrable from the outside. Its thick walls and limited access made it an ideal place for someone wishing to control, or conceal, powerful individuals. It's almost as if the very stones of the tower are already whispering tales of intrigue and confinement. The entry of Edward V into the tower, though initially presented as a precautionary measure, quickly took on a more ominous tone. He was no longer a king in waiting, freely moving about. He was a king in residence, and that residence was a fortress. The doors, once open to all the court, were slowly closing. Access to him became increasingly restricted, first for his Woodville relatives, then for others. You, the ordinary citizen, would hear these rumors. The young king is in the tower, people would say, their voices hushed. But when will he be crowned? The answers would be evasive, the delays growing longer, and the unease in the city would intensify. This moment, when the young, innocent king was led into the tower, marks a critical turning point. It was the moment he officially entered a place that, for him, would almost certainly become a gilded cage. He was literally putting himself into the hands of the very man who would soon become his greatest threat. Was he aware of the danger? Did he feel the trap closing around him? We can only imagine the thoughts of a 12-year-old boy, trusting his uncle, perhaps comforted by the apparent security of the fortress walls, yet unknowingly walking towards the precipice of a great mystery. The stage was set. The player was in his cage, and the next steps of Richard's plan were about to unfold. You were immersed in the unsettling atmosphere of London in the spring of 1483. Young King Edward V is securely, or perhaps insecurely, housed within the formidable walls of the tower. His coronation, the pivotal event meant to solidify his reign, remains strangely, maddeningly postponed. The city hums with whispers, a nervous energy that signals something is deeply amiss. And then comes another development that sends a chill down your spine. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the Lord Protector, demands that the younger prince, Richard, Duke of York, join his brother in the Tower. Remember, the younger Richard was still in sanctuary with his mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, at Westminster Abbey. This meant he was, legally speaking, untouchable. But Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was not a man to be deterred by legal niceties when power was at stake. The negotiations were tense. Richard argued that the two brothers should be together for comfort and security, and to ensure they were both present for the coronation. He publicly proclaimed that it was unseemly for the Duke of York, a royal prince, to remain in sanctuary like a common criminal or a fugitive. He used persuasion, veiled threats, and the immense power of his new position to pressure the Queen. Imagine the scene: messengers going back and forth between the Tower and Westminster Abbey, arguments being made, Queen Elizabeth's fear battling against the relentless pressure. Ultimately, fearing for her son's safety if he remained isolated, or perhaps believing that his presence with his brother would offer some mutual protection, Queen Elizabeth made the agonizing decision. She reluctantly released her youngest son from sanctuary. You can picture her, as heartbroken mother, bidding farewell to her 10-year-old boy, knowing she was surrendering him to the very man she most distrusted. It's a moment steeped in parental anguish, a grim choice forced upon her by an increasingly powerful and ruthless political machine. So the second prince, Richard, Duke of York, arrived at the Tower of London. He was reunited with his older brother, Edward V. On the surface, it might have seemed a comforting reunion for the two boys, allowing them to cling to each other in their strange, confined circumstances. But beneath that facade of brotherly solace, the reality was stark. Both potential heirs to the throne were now concentrated in one single, heavily guarded, and highly isolated location, completely at the mercy of their powerful uncle. It was like putting all your precious eggs into one very sturdy, very locked basket. But the person holding the key might have other plans. This act was crucial for Richard, Duke of Gloucester. By securing both princes, he eliminated the possibility of one being used as a figurehead by a rival faction. He had all the cards in his hand. No one could claim to be rallying behind the true king if the true king and his spare were both under Richard's absolute control. It simplified his political landscape immensely, allowing him to proceed with his ultimate designs without fear of a rival claimant emerging. Here's a somewhat disturbing, little-known detail: the conditions of the prince's confinement in the Tower, while still a royal residence, rapidly deteriorated from privileged guests to actual prisoners. While they were likely given comforts fitting their status, their access to the outside world, to their mother, and to their former tutors and attendants became severely restricted. Their royal household was gradually dismantled, and their servants replaced with men loyal to Richard. This incremental isolation suggests a deliberate plan, making their eventual disappearance far easier to orchestrate without external witnesses or interference. It was a slow strangulation of their connections to the world beyond the Tower walls. The official reason given for their confinement protection now sounded increasingly hollow. Why did they need such stringent protection inside a royal fortress? And why were they being kept away from their own mother? The questions would have circulated among the common people, growing louder with each passing day that the coronation was delayed. The mood in London must have been a peculiar mix of anticipation for a new king and a deep-seated apprehension about the true intentions of the Lord Protector. With both princes now within the Tower's formidable walls, the stage was perfectly set. Every potential obstacle had been removed, every rival eliminated or neutralized. Richard had orchestrated a masterful power grab, consolidating absolute control over the two most important figures in the kingdom. The legitimate line of succession was now entirely vulnerable, locked away, and soon about to vanish without a trace. The next chapter in this chilling story would see the most audacious move of all, shattering the very foundation of royal legitimacy in England. You're holding your breath in London, watching as the calendar pages turn. May turns to June, and still, no coronation for young Edward V. The air is thick with anticipation and, increasingly, with doubt. The constant delays, the isolation of the princes in the tower, it all points to something unsettling. People are starting to ask openly, when will our king be crowned? And the answers are becoming increasingly vague, bordering on evasive. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the Lord Protector, had a problem. He had the young king and his brother under lock and key. He had sidelined the Woodvillas. But he couldn't simply usurp the throne without a plausible justification. In medieval England, you couldn't just walk in and declare yourself king without a reason, no matter how powerful you were. You needed a narrative, a justification for bypassing the rightful heir. And so, a truly audacious claim began to circulate, a rumor so scandalous it would shake the very foundations of the late King Edward I's reign. The whispers started small, perhaps in the taverns and marketplaces, then grew louder, fueled by Richard's supporters. The core of this shocking accusation was that King Edward I's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the two princes, was supposedly invalid. The specific claim revolved around a pre-contract of marriage. It was alleged that before Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville, he had secretly entered into a marriage contract with another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler. In the eyes of the church at the time, a pre-contract, even if not formally consummated or celebrated, could render a subsequent marriage invalid. If Edward IV was already married to Lady Eleanor, then his later marriage to Elizabeth Woodville would be bigamous, and any children born from that union would be considered illegitimate. Imagine the shockwaves this would send. If the princes were illegitimate, they had no legal claim to the throne whatsoever. It was a cunning and devastating blow to their legitimacy. It turned them from rightful heirs into mere commoners, effectively disinheriting them without a drop of blood being shed yet. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a character assassination of their parents, and a complete dismantling of their royal identity. The person who championed this claim was a clergyman named Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells. He claimed to have personally conducted, or at least witnessed, the secret pre-contract between Edward IV and Lady Eleanor Butler. He presented his evidence to a gathering of noblemen and clergymen. Of course, the validity of his testimony is still hotly debated. Was he coerced? Was he lying? Or was there a kernel of truth to his claim, an old secret that Richard conveniently exploited? Historians still wrangle over this. It's a classic case where the facts are incredibly murky, probably deliberately so, and have been for centuries. Here's a bizarre and rather chilling detail. Lady Eleanor Butler herself had died years before this accusation was made public. This meant she couldn't confirm or deny the story, making it incredibly convenient for those who wished to push the narrative of an invalid marriage. Her silence from the grave only added to the mystery and the convenience of the claim. It's almost too perfect, isn't it? The public reaction would have been mixed. Some would have been genuinely shocked and perhaps believed the claim, especially if it was presented by respected figures like a bishop. Others, however, might have been deeply skeptical, seeing it as a blatant power grab. You, the average Londoner, might have heard the arguments batted back and forth, trying to make sense of a legal and religious claim that had massive political ramifications. Their parents weren't truly married. You might wonder, does that mean the boys aren't king? The culmination of this audacious declaration came on June 25. Josebasen, a document, known as the Titulus Regis Latin for the royal title, was presented to Parliament. This document formally declared Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid and, consequently, declared his children, including the two princes in the Tower, illegitimate. It explicitly stated that the rightful heir to the throne was none other than Richard, Duke of Gloucester himself. This was the legal and religious justification Richard needed. It stripped the young princes of their birthright, not by force of arms, but by an alleged legal technicality. It was a brilliant, if utterly cynical, manipulation of the law and public opinion. The path was now cleared for Richard to ascend the throne. The boys, once symbols of hope, were now declared nobodies. Their royal blood turned to mere common reed. The stage was set for a new king, and a terrifyingly blank page for the fate of two young, disinherited princes. You're in the thick of it now, the culmination of Richard's meticulously orchestrated power play. With the titulus regis formally declaring his nephews illegitimate, the path to the throne was not just cleared, it was virtually paved for him. The young King Edward V, locked away in the Tower, was no longer recognized as the rightful monarch. His little brother, Richard, Duke of York, was similarly cast aside. On June 26, just the day after the titulus regis was presented, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, accepted the crown of England. He ascended the throne as King Richard III. Imagine the whirlwind of events, from Lord Protector to King in a matter of weeks, all achieved with a shocking speed that must have left many reeling. The coronation of Richard II took place on July 6, at Westminster Abbey, a grand and elaborate ceremony befitting a new monarch, despite the whispers and uncertainties that must have hung heavy in the air. For you, the common person, this would have been a moment of profound confusion and possibly fear. One day you have a young, legitimate king in waiting. The next, his powerful uncle has declared himself monarch, based on a controversial legal argument that many might have struggled to fully comprehend. Did you cheer for the new king, or did you look around nervously, wondering what this sudden change meant for the stability of the realm, and perhaps for the fate of the dethroned princes? Richard II's reign began with a determined effort to consolidate his power. He made royal progresses through the country, showcasing himself as the new, strong leader, dispensing justice, and attempting to win popular support. He tried to present himself as a capable and just ruler, aiming to bring order after the instability of the Woodville period and the Wars of the Roses. He was certainly effective in many administrative respects. He introduced legal reforms and tried to improve the lives of common people, making some laws more accessible. So he wasn't just a ruthless usurper. He was also a king who understood the need for effective governance. However, the dark shadow of the two young princes in the Tower hung over his reign from day one. Their very existence, even if declared illegitimate, is a constant threat. As long as they were alive, even if imprisoned, they represented a potential rallying point for any opposition. Any disgruntled noble or ambitious rival could claim to be fighting for the true line, using the boys as a figurehead. This made their continued existence a profound political liability for Richard III. Historians have debated the legitimacy of Richard II's claim for centuries. Was the titulus regis a genuine legal finding, or a cynical fabrication designed to justify a coup? Many contemporary chroniclers, especially those writing after Richard's defeat by Henry Tudor, certainly portrayed him as a ruthless usurper. But others argue that he genuinely believed his brother's marriage was invalid, or that he was convinced by powerful figures around him that taking the throne was the only way to prevent renewed civil war laid by the Woodvilles. It's one of the great historical who really knew questions, as the key players are long gone and their true motives buried with them. Here's a rather revealing historical anecdote. Richard III, despite his rather sinister reputation, was supposedly quite popular in the north of England, where he had served for many years as a capable governor. He was known for his justice and leadership there. When he became king, this northern support base was incredibly important to him. But this popularity did not extend to London or the south, where the memory of Edward IV and the Woodville family was stronger, and the rumors about the princes were more rampant. It highlights the regional divisions of medieval England and how different parts of the country had wildly different perceptions of the same monarch. The coronation was a spectacular display of power and legitimacy, but it was also perhaps an overcompensation. Every crown, every jewel, every trumpet blast was meant to assert that Richard was now the divinely ordained ruler. Yet in the back of everyone's minds, the question lingered: what of the two boys, still behind those formidable tower walls? What would happen to them now that their uncle was king? Their fate, post-usurpation, became the most pressing and whispered question of Richard II's early reign. They were no longer royal wards in protection. They were now high-profile prisoners. Their very silence from within the tower walls grew louder and more ominous with each passing day. The public knew they were there, and the public knew they were legitimate heirs. And soon, the uncomfortable reality which set in silence can often be the loudest indicator of a dark truth. The throne was secured, but the stain of its acquisition, and the missing princes, would forever haunt Richard II. You're holding your breath, along with everyone else in England, waiting for news from the tower. Richard II has been crowned. The titulus regis has done its work, and the princes are no longer heirs, but merely inconvenient obstacles. What happens next? The answer is chilling in its simplicity: nothing. Or rather, silence. The two young princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were last reliably seen playing in the Tower Gardens in the late summer of 1483. After that, they simply vanished. They stopped appearing in public. They stopped being mentioned in official records. They just disappeared. It's like a magic trick, but with two very real, very vulnerable boys. Imagine the effect this had on the people. At first, perhaps just whispers. Have you seen the princes? Are they well? Then, as weeks turned into months, and their absence became undeniable, the whispers would have grown louder, turning into outright speculation, and then, for many, a grim certainty. Rumors would have spread like wildfire through London's taverns, markets, and churches. They've been moved. They're dead. The king, he must have. The unspoken implications were terrifying. The crucial point here is the lack of any official explanation. Richard I never publicly announced what had happened to his nephews. There were no pronouncements of their illness, no reports of them being sent away, no burials, no public mourning, nothing. Their silence was the loudest statement of all. This lack of transparency, a complete void of information, cemented the suspicion that something deeply nefarious had occurred. If they were safe, why weren't they seen? If they were alive, why weren't they produced to quell the rumors? This absolute lack of a paper trail, of any official record of their fate, is what makes the princes in the tower one of history's greatest cold cases. No death certificates, no burial records, no credible eyewitness accounts of their removal or demise. It's a complete black hole of information, stretching back over 5 centuries. This very lack of evidence is, paradoxically, the strongest piece of evidence for foul play. After all, what else explains such a total erasure? Historians still vehemently debate the exact timing and circumstances of their disappearance. Some believe it happened very quickly after Richard II's coronation, perhaps in July or August of 1483. Others suggest it might have taken longer, perhaps into the autumn. Without a confession, without a body at least, not a definitively identified one for centuries, and without reliable witnesses, it's impossible to pinpoint the precise moment. This frustrating ambiguity only deepens the mystery and allows for endless speculation. Here's a rather chilling detail about the atmosphere on the tower. It's said that once the boys disappeared, guards were reportedly given strict orders not to allow anyone to approach their known living quarters, and even less to speak of their whereabouts. The sense of secrecy and an ominous hush would have permeated the fortress. Imagine being a guard, knowing these 2 children were inside, and then suddenly, they weren't seen anymore, and any mention of them was met with a stern, silencing glance. It must have been profoundly unsettling. The vacuum left by their disappearance was filled with fear and suspicion. Many, both at the time and in later centuries, immediately assumed the worst, that they had been murdered. and the finger of blame, quite naturally, pointed directly at the man who benefited most from their absence, King Richard III. Their disappearance cleared the way for his secure reign, removing the only remaining threats to his throne. The complete silence, the sudden cessation of any public sign of the princes, was a powerful message. It was a de facto declaration that they were no longer a factor. For Richard III, this was a calculated risk. While it removed a threat, it also created a permanent stain on his reputation, a dark stain that even centuries later refuses to fade. The whispers that began in 1483 have never truly stopped, echoing through the halls of history, forever asking what happened to the princes in the tower. Their story, or rather, the lack of their story, became the defining feature of Richard II's controversial reign. The boys simply evaporated, leaving behind one of history's most enduring and most tragic questions. You're back in the streets of 15th century London, but the atmosphere has changed. The initial shock of Richard II's swift ascension has given way to a palpable tension, a hum of unease. The coronation was grand. The new king is making his progresses, but one question hangs heavy in the air, whispered in hushed tones behind closed doors: what happened to the princes? The official silence regarding Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, was deafening. No announcements, no sightings, no credible reports. This vacuum of information quickly filled with the most unsettling of rumors. People talked. They whispered in the marketplace, in the taverns, in the churches. Stories spread like wildfire, often exaggerated, but always circling back to the same grim conclusion: the boys were gone. Imagine trying to go about your daily life, a baker kneading dough, a weaver at his loom, a fishmonger calling out his wares while constantly overhearing snippets of these conversations. They say the tower's gates are shut tight. I heard a guard was dismissed for asking too many questions. The Queen Mother, in sanctuary, she weeps for them. The sheer lack of official information fueled endless speculation, allowing people's worst fears to take root and blossom into widespread belief. The most common and enduring rumor, of course, was that the princes had been murdered, and the finger of blame, quite naturally, pointed directly at their uncle, King Richard III. He was the one who benefited most from their disappearance. He was the one who had them in his custody. The public, connecting the dots, might have concluded that if the boys were alive and well, Richard would have produced them to silence the damaging rumors and secure his reign. His failure to do so was interpreted by many as an admission of guilt. These rumors weren't just idle gossip. They had real political ramifications. They undermined Richard II's legitimacy and made it difficult for him to secure the full loyalty of his subjects. Even those who initially supported him, or were neutral, might have begun to feel a pang of conscience or a flicker of doubt. How could a king, who ascended to the throne on the back of such a dark cloud, truly be just? The spread of these stories was amplified by the social networks at the time. While there was no internet or mass media, news traveled remarkably fast through word of mouth, through merchants, pilgrims, and especially through priests and friars who moved between communities. A curious historical detail: the Inns of Court, where lawyers trained, were also hotbeds of political discussion and gossip. Smart, ambitious young men would be debating the legalities and implications of the titulus regis and the prince's disappearance, further circulating and analyzing the rumors. It was an intellectual echo chamber that amplified the public discourse. Furthermore, these rumors weren't just circulating among the common folk. They reached the ears of disgruntled nobles and exiled Lancastrians, giving them a powerful tool to rally opposition against Richard III. The missing princes became a rallying cry, a symbol of Richard's alleged tyranny and an argument for his removal. It provided a moral justification for rebellion. One of the most immediate consequences of these rumors was the Buckingham Rebellion in late 1483. The Duke of Buckingham, who had been Richard's staunch ally and instrumental in his rise to power, suddenly turned against him. While Buckingham's motives are complex and still debated by historians, was it personal ambition, a genuine change of heart, or fear? The widespread belief that Richard had murdered his nephews certainly played a role. The rebellion aimed to restore the legitimate line, though it quickly shifted to supporting Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant living in exile. This swift rebellion, so soon after Richard's coronation, vividly demonstrates the power of the rumors and the instability they created. The court of Richard II must have been a tense place. While outwardly loyal, many within his own circle would have been aware of the whispers, and some might have even harbored their own suspicions. Trust would have been a rare and precious commodity. It's an interesting point of contention among historians. How much did Richard's inner circle really know? Did they believe his justifications? Or were they just as much in the dark? Or perhaps complicit in the silence? We'll likely never fully know the uncomfortable truths exchanged behind closed doors. So, for you, the ordinary person navigating this uncertain world, the silence from the tower was less a lack of information and more an ominous confirmation. It wasn't just a royal mystery. It was a societal wound, constantly picked at by the relentless spread of gossip and fear. The princes were gone, and the kingdom knew it. Their disappearance, initially a private act, had exploded into a public scandal that would forever stain the reputation of the man who now sat on the throne. You've just witnessed the widespread fear and suspicion surrounding the disappearance of the princes, and how it directly led to the collapse of initial support for Richard III. Now, let's fast forward a couple of years to a pivotal moment that would dramatically change the course of English history and eventually pave the way for a new dynasty. Enter Henry Tudor. He was a distant claimant to the throne, from the House of Lancaster, who had spent most of his life in exile in Brittany and France, carefully avoiding the clutches of the Yorkist kings. He was not born into immense power or wealth, and his claim to the throne was, frankly, rather tenuous through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. However, the political turmoil in England, especially the deepened popularity of Richard II due to the rumors about the princes, presented him with an unexpected opportunity. Imagine Henry Tudor in exile. He has been biding his time, constantly under threat, but always keeping an eye on England. News of the missing princes, the tumultuous regus, and Richard II's controversial ascension would have reached him. He saw a window, a chance to unite the disgruntled elements of English society, the remaining Lancastrian supporters, the disaffected Yorkists who opposed Richard III, and crucially, those who were horrified by the fate of the princes. Henry Tudor shrewdly understood that the key to gaining widespread support was to offer a resolution to the Wars of the Roses. His brilliant political stroke was to propose a marriage alliance with Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of the late Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and therefore the sister of the missing princes. This was a masterstroke. It meant that if he won, he would unite the warring houses of Lancaster his side and York her side, effectively bringing an end to the decades of bloodshed and factionalism. It offered the promise of long-awaited peace and unity. This proposed marriage made him a legitimate alternative to Richard III. For many Yorkists who disliked Richard, but would lend support a pure Lancastrian claimant, Elizabeth of York's involvement made Henry Tudor palatable. It was a promise of healing, a promise that the kingdom could finally move on from the destructive civil war. You, the ordinary person, would have heard this news with a mix of hope and skepticism. Could this distant exile truly bring peace? Could he really challenge the king? The culmination of Henry Tudor's ambitions and the widespread discontent with Richard III came on August 22, Yosibau. Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small invasion force and marched towards England, gathering support along the way. Richard III, aware of the threat, quickly mustered his forces and met Henry's army at Bosworth Field. The Battle of Bosworth Field was the decisive engagement. It was a relatively short but brutal clash. Richard III, despite being outnumbered, fought bravely and fiercely, perhaps even recklessly. determined to hold on to his crown. He famously charged directly towards Henry Tudor himself, hoping to end the war with a single decisive blow. However, fate and the shifting loyalties of key figures like the powerful Stanley family, who only declared for Henry at the last minute, were not on his side. Richard III was killed in battle, making him the last English king to die on the battlefield. His crown was reportedly found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head right there on the field, marking the dramatic end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor era. It was a moment of profound significance, witnessed by many, a tangible shift in power right before their eyes. Here's a grisly, but historically fascinating detail. After Richard II was killed, his naked body was apparently strapped over a horse and brought back to Leicester, where it was put on public display. This was a common, if barbaric, practice for defeated kings, meant to prove his death and deter any lingering loyalties. Imagine seeing the disgraced king, when so powerful, treated with such indignity. It was a stark reminder of the brutal realities of power in medieval England. With Richard II dead, Henry Tudor ascended the throne as King Henry VII. His victory at Bosworth marked the true end of the Wars of the Roses. He promptly married Elizabeth of York, fulfilling his promise and symbolically uniting the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York into the new Tudor rose. This marriage was crucial for establishing the legitimacy of his new dynasty. It absorbed the York IST claim into his own, ensuring that no future contender could legitimately claim to represent the York IST line against him, at least not without challenge. So, the dark shadow cast by the disappearance of the princes ultimately contributed to Richard II's downfall. The fear and suspicion they generated helped galvanize support for Henry Tudor, providing him with the moral high ground and a powerful narrative for change. While Henry VI never officially explained what happened to the princes, his victory implicitly closed that chapter of uncertainty, paving the way for a new era in English history, one that would, ironically, be forever haunted by the very mystery that helped bring it to power. You're now fast-forwarding to a much later period, almost 2 centuries after the disappearance of the princes. The Tudors have come and gone. The Stuarts are on the throne, and the memory of the 2 lost boys in the tower has become an enduring, unsettling legend. But then, in 1674, a discovery was made that jolted the ancient cold case back into the realm of the tangible. Imagine you're a workman inside the Tower of London, specifically near the White Tower, where the princes were believed to have been housed. King Charles II, the reigning monarch, was undertaking some renovations and improvements within the tower complex. Perhaps they were demolishing an old staircase or clearing out some rubble. And there, buried deep beneath the steps leading to the chapel of the White Tower, they found something truly grim, a wooden chest containing the skeletons of 2 children. This discovery sent a shiver down the spine of everyone who heard about it. 2 child skeletons, hidden away in the very place where the princes had vanished. The immediate conclusion, for many, was unavoidable. These must be the remains of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. The bones were found at a depth and in a location that suggested a deliberate, secret burial, not a casual or accidental one. It was exactly the kind of macabre discovery that whispered of foul play and a hurried concealment. King Charles II, upon hearing of the discovery, ordered that the bones be placed in an urn and interred with appropriate ceremony in Westminster Abbey. They were eventually laid to rest in the Henry VII Chapel, alongside other royal figures, ironically placed near the tomb of their potential murderer, Richard III, as well as the founder of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII. This act of reburial by a later monarch certainly lent weight to the belief that these were indeed the royal princes, acknowledging their tragic fate. However, despite the strong circumstantial evidence, a definitive identification was impossible at the time. Forensic science as we know it didn't exist in the 17th century. There was no way to perform DNA analysis, no way to accurately determine the children's precise ages, or to look for specific physical characteristics that would confirm their identities. The only thing they could do was deduce based on the location and the historical context. It's a classic example of historical evidence being tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly out of reach of full verification. Here's a somewhat quirky, but deeply significant detail. The bones were examined by a physician at the time, who determined they were of children roughly the ages of the princes, around 10 and 12, 13 years old. While this was a rough estimate, it aligned perfectly with the known ages of Edward V and Richard. This circumstantial alignment added considerable weight to the assumption that these were the lost princes, despite the lack of definitive scientific proof. This discovery of the bones didn't solve the mystery of who killed them, but it certainly seemed to confirm that they were indeed dead, and that their disappearance was a result of murder rather than, say, escape or quiet exile. It provided a grim, tangible endpoint to the rumors that had circulated for so long, turning the abstract horror into a concrete, physical reality. The discovery also reinvigorated the debate surrounding Richard III. For many, the bones were undeniable proof of his guilt. The fact that the bodies were found hidden, rather than given a proper, public burial, strongly suggested an attempt to conceal a crime. It reinforced the popular image of Richard as a ruthless tyrant, willing to eliminate even his own nephews to secure the throne. Of course, for a small but dedicated group of historians and enthusiasts, these bones are still not absolute proof. They argue that without modern forensic analysis, we can't be 100% sure they are the princes. What if they were to other children, perhaps unconventional, buried there for some reason? While this is a minority view, it highlights the enduring nature of historical doubt when definitive scientific evidence is lacking. Historians are still very much in disagreement over whether to conduct further examinations of the bones using modern technology. It's a delicate balance between respecting the deceased and fulfilling historical curiosity. So, while the discovery of the bones in 1674 didn't bring absolute closure, it certainly cemented the popular belief that the princes had met a violent end within the tower walls. It provided a chilling physical manifestation of a dark historical secret, ensuring that the tale of the two lost boys would continue to captivate and haunt generations to come. The question now shifted from where are they to who killed them, a question that would primarily point to one man. You're now standing in the court of public opinion, where for centuries, one figure has stood as the prime suspect in the case of the princes in the tower, King Richard III. He is the one painted as the villain, the ruthless uncle who murdered his innocent nephews to seize the throne. But what exactly is the case against him? Let's lay out the evidence, circumstantial as much of it is. First and foremost, the motive. This is the big one. Richard II was the only person who directly benefited from the prince's disappearance. With Edward V and Richard of York out of the way, declared illegitimate and then vanished, Richard's path to the throne was clear and secure. Without them, there was no legitimate rival claimant to challenge his reign. In a Game of Thrones, this is often the strongest piece of evidence against a suspect. It's like finding a smoking gun in the hand of the only person who profits from the death. Secondly, opportunity. Richard had direct control over the princes. They were in his custody in the Tower of London. He was the only one who could have ordered or facilitated their removal or murder without alerting a larger number of people. He had the power, the access, and the absolute authority within the fortress. No one else could have simply made them disappear from inside the most secure building in England without his knowledge or command. Thirdly, the timing. The princes vanished very shortly after Richard II's coronation in July 1483. This swift disappearance, so close to his consolidation of power, strongly suggests a deliberate act. If they were meant to be kept alive, why the immediate, absolute silence? Why the lack of any official explanation? This sudden cessation of public appearances or official mention is incredibly damning. Fourth, the titulus regus. This document, which declared the princes illegitimate, was a crucial step in paving Richard's way to the throne. It was a preemptive strike against their claim, and it was engineered by Richard and his supporters. For many, this manipulation of legal and religious authority to disinherit his nephews was a clear sign of his ruthless ambition and his willingness to go to extreme lengths. Finally, the reaction of his contemporaries. While some nobles certainly supported Richard, others, like the Duke of Buckingham, who had initially been his ally, turned against him shortly after the prince's disappearance. The widespread rumors of their murder certainly fueled the Buckingham Rebellion and helped rally support for Henry Tudor. This suggests that even at the time, many people believed Richard was responsible, and that this belief carried significant political weight. Here's a curious little detail often brought up by those who defend Richard I. He was a devout man for his time, known for his piety. Would such a man truly commit such a heinous act against his own nephews? This is a point of contention. Some argue that his piety was genuine, making the murder unlikely. Others argue that political necessity in the ruthless world of medieval power grabs could easily override religious scruples, especially if he convinced himself it was for the greater good of avoiding renewed civil war. Many historical accounts, particularly those written after the Tudor dynasty came to power, also heavily incriminate Richard III. Thomas More's History of Richard II, written during the reign of Henry VII, painted a very dark and unflattering portrait of Richard as a deformed, cruel, and cunning murderer. While More's work is a literary masterpiece, it also served a political purpose for the Tudors, validating their usurpation by demonizing their predecessor. This immensely influential portrayal deeply shaped future perceptions of Richard III. Scholars today still debate the nuances. While the evidence against Richard II is largely circumstantial, the combination of motive, opportunity, and the suspicious timing of the prince's disappearance makes him, therefore, the most likely culprit in the eyes of most historians. It's almost too convenient, for him to be entirely innocent. The case against him isn't built on a single smoking gun confession, but on a mountain of circumstantial evidence that paints a very grim picture. His reign, though short, became indelibly stained by the unsolved disappearance of his nephews, a mystery that would follow him even to his death on the battlefield. You've heard the compelling case against Richard III, the prime suspect. But what if the popular narrative, largely shaped by the victors of history, isn't the whole truth? Let's now turn our gaze to the second major suspect, one whose involvement would make the story even more tragically ironic: Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Imagine a world where Henry Tudor, the man who eventually defeated Richard II and united the warring houses, actually had a hand in the prince's disappearance. Why would he do such a thing? After all, he championed himself as the unifier, the man who brought peace. The motive for Henry VI is subtly different but no less powerful. While Richard I was threatened by the princes as long as they were legitimate heirs, Henry VI would be threatened by them even if they were declared illegitimate. Think about it, they were the direct male heirs of the previous King Edward IV. Even if declared bastards, they still carried the powerful York ISD bloodline. Any rebellion against Henry VII, any disgruntled York ISD noble, could have rallied around one of the princes as a figurehead, demanding the restoration of the true line, regardless of their declared legitimacy. They represented a potent, living alternative to his newly established Tudor dynasty. Henry VI's position was precarious. His own claim to the throne was not terribly strong. It came through a rather convoluted Lancastrian line and was further legitimized by conquest and his marriage to Elizabeth of York. Having to living, even imprisoned, York ISD princes was a constant sword of Damocles hanging over his head. If they were alive, even in exile, they would always be a source of potential trouble, a beacon for unrest. So, the argument goes, if Richard I hadn't already murdered them, then Henry VI might have. It would have been a matter of securing his new throne. The common theory among this line of thinking is that Richard might have indeed removed them from the tower and quietly imprisoned them elsewhere, or perhaps even planned to release them once his reign was secure. But then, Henry Tudor defeated Richard at Bosworth Field. What if Henry then found them, alive, and realizing the immense threat they posed, quietly dispatched them himself? The argument for Henry VII's guilt often points to his lack of effort in finding or producing the princes once he became king. If they were alive and well, and Richard I was truly the monster who killed them, wouldn't Henry have paraded them out, or at least investigated their disappearance thoroughly, to further blacken Richard's name and solidify his own legitimacy? The fact that he didn't, and that the official silence continued, is seen by some as suspicious. He simply allowed the mystery to continue, perhaps because the truth would be inconvenient for him. Here's a curious detail that adds to the intrigue during Henry VII's reign. There were several pretenders who claimed to be one of the lost princes, most famously Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York. Henry VII went to great lengths to discredit and ultimately execute these pretenders. If the real princes were long dead at the hands of Richard III, one might expect Henry VII to have produced evidence of their deaths, or their bodies, to quash these rebellions definitively. His failure to do so, preferring to simply crush the pretenders, is seen by some as an indicator that he couldn't produce the real princes' bodies because he himself was responsible for their deaths. However, historians who typically defend Richard II and point the finger at Henry VI often face an uphill battle. There is no direct evidence, no contemporary accounts that explicitly accuse Henry VII. Most sources that point to Henry's guilt are speculative or emerge much later, often from those hostile to the Tudor dynasty. The strongest argument for Henry's culpability is an argument from silence or inaction, which can be difficult to prove conclusively. The problem with this theory, as historians still debate, is that Henry VII's primary goal was stability and legitimacy. If he had found the princes alive, it would have been a huge propaganda coup to present them, alive and well, as a testament to Richard II's wickedness and his own virtue. It's difficult to argue why he wouldn't have done that if he could have. This is a point that academic circles still find a little sticky. Ultimately, while Henry VII certainly had a motive to ensure the princes were not a threat, the historical consensus leans much more heavily towards Richard III. However, the Henry VII did it theory adds a layer of deliciously dark irony to the tale. The man who brought peace and ended the war may have done so by tying up a few loose ends of his own. It just goes to show that in the brutal game of medieval thrones, even the heroes can have very dark secrets. You've considered the two main contenders for the grim title of Prince Slayer. But what if the truth lies outside the obvious suspects? In the murky realm of lesser-known factions or individuals, this is where historical cold cases truly frustrate and fascinate, as possibilities expand beyond the immediate beneficiaries. Let's explore some of the more niche what-if theories surrounding the princes in the tower. One lesser-known theory suggests that the princes might have died of natural causes within the tower. It was, after all, a medieval fortress. Conditions could be unforgiving, diseases rampant, and sudden illness a common killer, especially for children. Perhaps they contracted something like the plague, typhus, or some other virulent disease that swept through populations with terrifying speed. If they died of natural causes, Richard II might have simply covered it up to avoid the damaging perception that he couldn't even keep royal wards safe, or perhaps to avoid the negative optics of their deaths occurring while in his custody. He might have feared being blamed regardless. The problem with this theory, as historians debate, is that a natural death of royal children would typically be publicly announced, followed by an elaborate funeral and burial. This would confirm their demise and eliminate them as a political threat. The absolute silence and lack of any official record of their illness or death works against this natural causes theory. It's hard to imagine any king, even a ruthless one, failing to capitalize on the natural death of a rival to solidify his position. Another, more intriguing, but highly speculative theory involves a clandestine escape or smuggling operation. What if loyalists managed to get one or both of the princes out of the tower, perhaps replacing them with other children who then perished? This would explain the lack of bodies for a time, and it would account for the later appearance of pretenders who claimed to be one of the princes. It's the stuff of thrilling historical fiction, where secret tunnels and daring rescues save the day. However, the Tower of London was an incredibly secure fortress. Orchestrating such an escape, especially for the royal children who would have been under constant surveillance, would have been an almost impossible feat without leaving a significant trail of evidence or witnesses. And if they did escape, why did they never resurface to challenge Richard II's reign? Or later, Henry VII's? This theory struggles to explain the enduring silence from the princes themselves. As one academic might put it, while an intriguing narrative, the logistical challenges presented by this hypothesis remain largely unaddressed. Then there's the possibility of a third party, perhaps a disgruntled noble, acting without Richard II's direct orders, but perhaps with his implicit approval or even to preemptively please him. What if someone like the Duke of Buckingham, or another powerful figure, decided to take matters into their own hands, believing it would benefit their standing with Richard, or simply to eliminate potential instability? This would alleviate direct culpability from Richard while still serving his ultimate goal. Here's a rather obscure, but darkly amusing, historical quirk to consider. Medieval England was full of bizarre and sometimes surprisingly incompetent schemes. Think of all the failed rebellions and plots that were quickly uncovered. If a third party did somehow manage to kill the princes, it's almost more remarkable that they managed to keep it a secret for so long, given how leaky medieval courts and noble households often were. It's a testament to the effectiveness of the cover-up, whoever orchestrated it. Another very minor, and often dismissed, theory suggests the boys were simply removed from the tower and lived out their lives in obscurity, perhaps in a monastery, under new identities. This would explain their disappearance without resorting to murder. But again, it's hard to reconcile this with the complete and utter lack of any verifiable sightings or evidence of their lives after 1483. Royal children, even those in disgrace, leave some kind of trail. Ultimately, while these alternative theories add layers of complexity and intrigue to the mystery, they generally lack the strong, albeit circumstantial, evidence that points towards the primary suspects. The motive, opportunity, and the subsequent benefit for Richard III, or later Henry VII, remain the most compelling arguments for their respective culpability. The other possibilities often unravel when faced with the sheer lack of corroborating evidence or logical consistency. It's not that they're impossible, it's just that they require a larger leap of faith to believe. The mystery endures precisely because there are just enough tantalizing loose ends to prevent complete closure, even after centuries of debate. You've considered the two main contenders for the grim title of Prince Slayer. But what is the popular narrative, largely shaped by the victors of history, isn't the whole truth? Let's now turn our gaze to the second major suspect, one whose involvement would make the story even more tragically ironic: Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Imagine a world where Henry Tudor, the man who eventually defeated Richard II and united the warring houses, actually had a hand in the prince's disappearance. Why would he do such a thing? After all, he championed himself as the unifier, the man who brought peace. The motive for Henry VII is subtly different but no less powerful. While Richard II was threatened by the princes as long as they were legitimate heirs, Henry VII would be threatened by them, even if they were declared illegitimate. Think about it, they were the direct male heirs of the previous King Edward IV. Even if declared bastards, they still carried the powerful York IST bloodline. Any rebellion against Henry VII, any disgruntled York IST noble, could have rallied around one of the princes as a figurehead, demanding the restoration of the true line, regardless of their declared legitimacy. They represented a potent, living alternative to his newly established Tudor dynasty. Henry VI's position was precarious. His own claim to the throne was not terribly strong. It came through a rather convoluted Lancastrian line and was further legitimized by conquest and his marriage to Elizabeth of York. Having to living, even imprisoned, Yorkshire St. princes was a constant sword of Damocles hanging over his head. If they were alive, even in exile, they would always be a source of potential trouble, a beacon for unrest. So the argument goes, if Richard II hadn't already murdered them, then Henry VII might have. It would have been a matter of securing his new throne. The common theory among this line of thinking is that Richard II might have indeed removed them from the tower and quietly imprisoned them elsewhere, or perhaps even planned to release them once his reign was secure. But then, Henry Tudor defeated Richard at Bosworth Field. What if Henry then found them, alive, and realizing the immense threat they posed, quietly dispatched them himself? The argument for Henry VI's guilt often points to his lack of effort in finding or producing the princes once he became king. If they were alive and well, and Richard II was truly the monster who killed them, wouldn't Henry have paraded them out, or at least investigated their disappearance thoroughly? To further blacken Richard's name and solidify his own legitimacy, the fact that he didn't, and that the official silence continued, is seen by some as suspicious. He simply allowed the mystery to continue, perhaps because the truth would be inconvenient for him. Here's a curious detail that adds to the intrigue during Henry VI's reign. There were several pretenders who claimed to be one of the lost princes, most famously Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York. Henry VII went to great lengths to discredit and ultimately execute these pretenders. If the real princes were long dead at the hands of Richard III, one might expect Henry VII to have produced evidence of their deaths, or their bodies, to quash these rebellions definitively. His failure to do so, preferring to simply crush the pretenders, is seen by some as an indicator that he couldn't produce the real princes' bodies because he himself was responsible for their deaths. However, historians who typically defend Richard II and point the finger at Henry VI often face an uphill battle. There's no direct evidence, no contemporary accounts that explicitly accuse Henry VI. Most sources that point to Henry's guilt are speculative or emerge much later, often from those hostile to the Tudor dynasty. The strongest argument for Henry's culpability is an argument from silence or inaction, which can be difficult to prove conclusively. The problem with this theory, as historians still debate, is that Henry VI's primary goal was stability and legitimacy. If he had found the princes alive, it would have been a huge propaganda coup to present them, alive and well, as a testament to Richard II's wickedness and his own virtue. It's difficult to argue why he wouldn't have done that if he could have. This is a point that academic circles still find a little sticky. Ultimately, while Henry VI certainly had a motive to ensure the princes were not a threat, the historical consensus leans much more heavily towards Richard II. However, the Henry VI did it theory adds a layer of deliciously dark irony to the tale. The man who brought peace and ended the war may have done so by tying up a few loose ends of his own. It just goes to show that in the brutal game of medieval thrones, even the heroes can have very dark secrets. You've heard the main theories and the fringe possibilities. Now let's pivot to a truly fascinating and frustrating element of this enduring mystery, the sudden appearance, years after the prince's disappearance, of an individual claiming to be one of them. This is where the story takes a turn into the realm of audacious impostors and deeply held beliefs. Enter Perkin Warbeck. Sometime in the 1492s, almost a decade after the princes vanished, a young man emerged on the European stage claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had disappeared in the tower. Imagine the sheer audacity. He was just a random claimant. he managed to gain significant international support, including recognition from various European monarchs and even the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. This was no small feat for a supposed impostor. Warbeck's story was that he and his elder brother, Edward V., had not been murdered in the tower. Instead, he claimed that they had been spirited away by loyalists. He asserted that Edward V. had died shortly after escaping, but he, Richard, had been smuggled to various European courts, living in hiding, waiting for the opportune moment to reclaim his birthright. His account was incredibly detailed, almost too perfect, explaining his long absence and his survival. Henry VI, the newly crowned king, was, of course, absolutely furious and profoundly threatened by Warbeck. The king had worked tirelessly to bring stability to England after the Wars of the Roses and to cement his Tudor dynasty. The re-emergence of a supposed Yorkshire prince, even one so long after the supposed disappearance, posed a direct and dangerous challenge to his legitimacy. If Warbeck truly was Richard, Duke of York, then Henry VI was a usurper, and his entire reign illegitimate. So Henry VI launched an intense propaganda campaign to discredit Warbeck, labeling him a base-born impostor. He produced witnesses who claimed to know Warbeck's true identity as the son of a boatman from Turnau. He sent spies to infiltrate Warbeck's network and gathered information to expose him as a fraud. This was a full-scale battle for public opinion, with the very foundation of the Tudor throne at stake. Here's a somewhat ironic detail: the very fact that Warbeck gained so much traction internationally, and that Henry VI took him so seriously, suggests that the mystery of the princes was still very much alive in people's minds. The lack of a definitive explanation or body meant that people were willing to believe a pretender, especially if they were already disaffected with Henry VI's rule. If the princes' deaths were publicly known and confirmed, Warbeck would likely have been dismissed outright. Historians still debate the true nature of Warbeck's support. Was it genuine belief in his identity, or simply a convenient rallying point for those opposed to Henry VI? Academic circles are always quick to remind us that political opportunism often trumps factual accuracy. Warbeck's career as a pretender was tumultuous. He attempted several invasions of England, notably in 1495 and 1497, but each was met with failure. He was eventually captured by Henry VI's forces. After confessing to being an impostor, he was initially treated relatively leniently, even being allowed to remain at court for a time. However, after further attempts to escape in plot, Henry VI ultimately had him executed in 1499. Perkin Warbeck's story is crucial to the mystery of the princes because it highlights the enduring uncertainty surrounding their fate. His existence, and the credulity he inspired, suggests that a significant portion of the population, both in England and abroad, did not fully believe the princes were dead, or at least they were willing to entertain the possibility that one had survived. It kept the flame of the mystery burning for decades after the initial disappearance. The fact that Henry VI felt compelled to execute Warbeck, rather than simply parading the real princes' bones if he had them and could definitively identify them, further fuels the speculation for some that Henry himself might have had something to hide regarding the prince's ultimate fate. Why not show the proof of their demise to shut down all future pretenders once and for all? This lack of definitive proof of death on Henry's part is a sticking point for those who suspect his involvement. So, Perkin Warbeck remains a fascinating and enigmatic figure. Was he a master deceiver, a brilliant actor who managed to fool kings and emperors, or was there a flicker of truth to his desperate claim, making his story even more tragic? The consensus among historians is that he was indeed an impostor, but his story undeniably kept the Tower of London mystery alive, forcing generations to ask if he wasn't Richard, where was the real prince? You're now looking at another crucial figure, not a suspect, but someone deeply entangled in the mystery, and its aftermath. Elizabeth of York. She was the eldest daughter of King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville, making her the older sister of the two missing princes, Edward V and Richard. Duke of York. Her life, caught between two warring dynasties, is a testament to the harsh realities of royal power and personal tragedy. Imagine Elizabeth. She would have been around 17 years old when her father died and her brothers disappeared. She witnessed the dramatic rise and fall of her mother's family, the Woodvilles. She saw her beloved father die unexpectedly, her brothers declared illegitimate and vanish, and her uncle usurp the throne. Her world, which should have been one of comfort and future queenship, was turned upside down by political machinations and probable murder. How much did she know? How much did she suspect? These are the silent questions that hang over her life. Her fate became intertwined with the man who would eventually defeat her uncle, Richard I. Henry Tudor. As you know, Henry Tudor shrewdly proposed a marriage to Elizabeth of York, as a means to unite the houses of Lancaster and York, effectively ending the Wars of the Roses. This wasn't a love match, at least not initially. It was a profoundly political union, but one that offered the tantalizing promise of peace. On August 22, Yosibau, Henry Tudor defeated and killed Richard I at the Battle of Bosworth Field, becoming King Henry VI. In January 1496, he married Elizabeth of York, fulfilling his promise and creating the Tudor dynasty. She became Queen Consort of England. Their marriage was immensely symbolic, visually represented by the Tudor rose, which combined the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York. It was meant to heal the bitter divisions that had torn England apart for decades. But here's the burning question that historians still ponder: what did Elizabeth of York know about her brother's fate? She was their sister. She lived through their disappearance and the subsequent shift in power. When she married Henry VI, did she ever try to discover the truth? Did she ever ask her new husband, the king, to investigate? Or did she, for the sake of the newly fragile peace and the security of her own position and future children, choose a pragmatic silence? It's tempting to imagine her, privately grieving, perhaps even suspecting her husband. But the historical record offers little direct insight into her personal thoughts on the matter. She was a queen, and her primary duty was to produce heirs for the new dynasty and to support her husband's reign. Publicly, she never spoke out about her brother's disappearance. Her silence on such a profound personal tragedy has led to much speculation. Was it silence born of fear, horror of acceptance, or perhaps even complicity in the need to ensure the new dynasty's security? Academic circles often highlight the immense pressures placed on royal women in this period, where personal feelings often had to be subservient to dynastic imperative. Here's a poignant, yet somewhat overlooked, detail about Elizabeth of York. Despite the political nature of their marriage, by many accounts, Henry VI and Elizabeth of York developed a genuine affection for each other over time. They had many children, including the future Henry VI, and their relationship appears to have been stable and loving, particularly after the birth of their children. This makes her silence on her brothers even more complex. Could she truly have loved a man who might have been responsible for their deaths, or who chose to ignore their fate? Or was her happiness in her new life intertwined with her silence? Elizabeth of York's position as a living link to the previous York dynasty was incredibly important to Henry VI. Her very presence as queen helped to legitimize his rule in the eyes of many Yorkists. Without her, Henry's claim would have been much weaker, and the Wars of the Roses might have lingered. She was the bridge between the old and the new. Her personal role in the mystery remains ambiguous. Was she a victim, a survivor, or an unwitting participant in a grand political cover-up? We can only speculate. But her silence, or the lack of any recorded inquiry, is a significant piece of the puzzle. It suggests that if the truth was ever known to the inner circle of the Tudor court, it was a secret so profoundly dangerous that it had to be buried, perhaps along with the princes themselves. Elizabeth of York lived a long and impactful life, but the shadow of her missing brothers would forever haunt her story, a silent, unaddressed tragedy at the heart of the Tudor founding myth. You're stepping into the realm of literature, where historical events are transformed, embellished, and sometimes, tragically, solidified into popular myth. For the princes in the tower, one name stands out as having an almost unparalleled influence on how history remembers their alleged murderer, Sir Thomas More. Imagine England in the early 16th century. Henry VIII is on the throne. The Tudor dynasty is firmly established, and the memory of the Wars of the Roses, and especially Richard III, is still relatively fresh. It's in this climate that Sir Thomas More, a brilliant humanist, lawyer, and later Lord Chancellor of England, began writing his history of King Richard III. Now, this wasn't an objective, detached historical account in the modern sense. More's work was a piece of Tudor propaganda, designed to justify the reign of Henry VIII's father by thoroughly demonizing Richard III. It was commissioned, or at least encouraged, by the Tudor regime, which had a vested interest in portraying Richard as a tyrannical usurper and child murderer. After all, if Richard was so evil, then Henry VII's overthrow of him was entirely righteous and divinely ordained. More's history famously painted Richard II as a monstrous figure, both physically and morally. He described Richard as ill-featured of limbs, crook-backed, his left shoulder much higher than his right, and with a malicious and cruel mind. While modern historical and archaeological evidence like the discovery of Richard's skeleton in 2012, showing scoliosis but not a severe hunchback, suggests More exaggerated the physical deformities, his moral portrayal was far more damaging and lasting. Crucially, it was More's history that provided the most detailed and widely accepted account of the prince's murder. More claimed that Richard III, through his agent Sir James Tyrrell, ordered the boys to be smothered in their beds within the tower. He even provided gruesome details, like the boys lying in their bed and sleeping, before Tyrrell's men laid a feather-bed and great store of clothes upon them. It was a chilling, vivid, and highly specific narrative that cemented Richard's guilt in the popular imagination. The impact of More's work cannot be overstated. It became the foundational text for later interpretations of Richard II's reign, especially regarding the princes. For centuries, anyone reading about this period would encounter More's compelling, though biased, narrative. It was published posthumously, circulated widely, and essentially became the official version of events. Here's a curious academic point. More himself was just a small child when the princess disappeared. His account was based on second-hand information, rumors, and likely political directives. He was not an eyewitness, and his sources for the supposed murder were never truly verified. This makes his account more a work of powerful narrative and political commentary than a meticulously researched historical document in today's understanding. Historians still grapple with how to use More's work, acknowledging its immense influence while critically assessing its factual basis. The problem with such a powerfully written, politically motivated text is that it shapes popular perception for generations, often becoming truth through sheer repetition, even if its factual accuracy is questionable. More's Richard II became the archetype of the evil, child-killing tyrant, a character so compelling that he would later inspire an even more famous work of literature. This takes us to the truly massive impact on historical memory. More's account was directly used as a primary source by William Shakespeare for his play, Richard II. Imagine that. The very narrative that we often think of as historical fact about Richard II and the princes, the one that everyone knows, largely stems from a brilliant playwright's interpretation of an earlier, politically motivated history. This recursive influence, where a historical work influences a play, which in turn solidifies a historical perception, is a fascinating aspect of how we remember the past. So, while Sir Thomas More's history of King Richard II might not be a purely objective historical record, it played an absolutely vital role in shaping the centuries-long perception of Richard I as the primary culprit in the disappearance of the princes. It created a powerful, enduring narrative of villainy that became deeply ingrained in the popular consciousness. making it incredibly difficult for subsequent generations to view Richard III through any other lens. He was, thanks in large part to Moore, forever branded as the child murderer, a literary villain made terrifyingly real. Yuri now moving from the scholarly prose of Sir Thomas More to the grand stage of the Globe Theatre, where the story of Richard II and the vanished princes would truly become immortalized. No single work of literature has had a greater impact on the popular perception of Richard II and, by extension, the mystery of the princes than William Shakespeare's play, Richard II. Imagine being in London in the late 16th century, just over a century after the actual events. You go to the theater, perhaps the newly built Globe, and settle in for a historical play. What you see unfold before you is a mesmerizing, horrifying, and utterly compelling drama. Shakespeare, drawing heavily from chroniclers like Moore and Holinshed, crafts a villain for the ages. Shakespeare's Richard II is presented as the quintessential Machiavellian villain, cunning, ruthless, manipulative, and physically deformed, symbolizing his inner wickedness. He famously declares in the opening lines, "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried." But he immediately follows this with his dark ambition, "I am determined to prove a villain." Crucially for our story, Shakespeare explicitly depicts Richard II as the murderer of the two young princes. In the play, Richard directly orders their deaths, instructing his agents, Tyrell and then Forston Dighton, to smother the boys in their sleep. The scene is brief but chilling, painting a clear picture of their demise. The play doesn't just imply, it unequivocally states that Richard is the perpetrator, leaving no room for doubt within the narrative. The impact of this play was, and remains, immense. Shakespeare was, and still is, arguably the greatest playwright in the English language. His works have been performed countless times, translated into virtually every language, and studied by generations. For hundreds of years, for most people, their understanding of Richard III and the prince's fate came directly from this dramatic portrayal. It effectively solidified More's propagandistic history into popular truth. Here's a curious academic point: Shakespeare was writing during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a staunchly Tudor monarch. By depicting Richard II as an unequivocal villain in child murder, Shakespeare's play served to further legitimize the Tudor dynasty. It reinforced the idea that the Tudors had rid England of a monster and brought stability. So while it's a brilliant piece of literature, it also perfectly aligned with the prevailing political narrative of the time. It's a great example of how art can shape, rather than just reflect, historical understanding. The theatrical nature of Shakespeare's portrayal also made it incredibly memorable. Richard II's famous lines, his soliloquies to the audience, his ruthless ambition, and the tragic innocence of the young princes, these elements resonated deeply. Audiences didn't just hear about history, they experienced it, albeit a dramatized version. This direct, emotional engagement made the narrative of Richard's guilt almost impossible to shake off. Even today, when someone mentions Richard III, the image that often comes to mind is Shakespeare's villain, the hunchback, the tyrant, the child murderer. This is the power of literature, to overshadow historical nuance and solidify a particular interpretation. The detailed academic debates about Richard's actual culpability often struggle to penetrate the deeply ingrained popular image created by Shakespeare. As many historians have lamented, Shakespeare wrote history, but he got it wrong. Yet, his version stuck. So, while historians continue to sift through meager contemporary evidence and argue over the true Richard III, the common understanding of the princes in the Tower is indelibly marked by Shakespeare. His dramatic genius took a historical cold case, imbued it with unforgettable characters and chilling details, and effectively wrote the final verdict in the minds of generations. For most, the mystery of who killed the princes was solved on the stage by the villainous figure of Richard III. leaving little room for doubt or alternative theories. You've heard the damning literary evidence, but now let's shift gears. Imagine a determined group of individuals, centuries after the fact, taking on the colossal task of challenging deeply ingrained historical narratives. This is the story of the Richard III Society, a passionate organization dedicated to rehabilitating the controversial king's reputation and, by extension, reopening the case of the princes in the Tower. The Richard II Society was founded in 1924. Initially as the Fellowship of the White Boar was Richard II's personal emblem. Their core mission is to promote research into the life and times of Richard II, and to re-examine the historical evidence, often challenging the traditional Tudor-influenced view that portrays him as a monstrous villain. They believe that Richard II has been unfairly maligned by history, largely due to politically motivated propaganda from the Tudor era and Shakespeare's dramatization. Their argument is simple yet profound. Richard III, as depicted by Moore and Shakespeare, is largely a caricature. They point out that many of the negative portrayals originated from Tudor sources who had a vested interest in justifying Henry VI's usurpation of the throne. They argue that contemporary accounts that speak well of Richard II, and there are some, particularly from the north of England, where he was popular, have been largely ignored or downplayed. When it comes to the princes in the Tower, the Richard II Society actively argues against his culpability. They raise valid points. Lack of definitive proof. They emphasize that there is no irrefutable, direct evidence, no confession, no undisputed eyewitness account that Richard II ordered the murder of his nephews. Motive for others. They often pivot to the idea that Henry VI had an even stronger motive to eliminate the princes once he became king, as their continued existence would forever threaten his newly established dynasty. If Richard had simply confined them, Henry would need to dispose of them. Other theories. They are more open to alternative theories, such as the princes dying of natural causes with Richard then covering it up, or even being spirited away, explaining the later pretenders. The Society doesn't just theorize. They actively promote scholarly research, publish journals, and organize events to present their arguments. They engage in historical detective work, scrutinizing documents, re-examining archaeological findings, and advocating for more scientific analysis where possible. Their efforts have certainly led to a more nuanced view of Richard II within academic circles, moving him away from the purely evil caricature. Here's a curious detail that truly put the Richard II Society on the map. Their tireless efforts to locate Richard II's lost grave finally paid off in 2012, when his skeleton was discovered beneath a car park in Leicester. This was an astonishing archaeological triumph, confirming his identity through DNA and historical records, and shedding new light on his physical condition, confirming scoliosis, but not the exaggerated hunchback. This discovery gave the Society immense credibility and proved that historical mysteries, even centuries old, can sometimes be cracked with persistent research and modern science. It also allowed scholars to directly compare his bones to Moore's description, confirming the exaggeration. However, despite their impressive work, the Society faces an uphill battle in the popular imagination. Shakespeare's shadow is long, and the image of the villainous Richard is deeply ingrained. Furthermore, while they've done much to rehabilitate his character, the no definitive proof argument still doesn't offer a conclusive alternative for the prince's fate. If Richard didn't do it, then who did? And why is there such a profound silence surrounding their ultimate end? Academics will tell you that while the Society has successfully injected doubt into the narrative, providing an equally compelling alternative killer with sufficient evidence remains the biggest challenge. So, the Richard II Society continues its noble quest to clear their king's name. They serve as a powerful reminder that history is not a static collection of facts, but an ongoing process of interpretation and reinterpretation. For the princes in the Tower, their efforts keep the case wide open, ensuring that the question of Richard II's guilt will continue to be debated, forcing us to constantly reevaluate the evidence and challenge the centuries-old verdict. You're back in the modern era, holding your breath not just for historical revelations, but for scientific breakthroughs. Imagine the advancements in forensic science, especially in DNA analysis, that have revolutionized how we solve cold cases. Could these tools, which bring justice to contemporary mysteries, finally shed light on the centuries-old disappearance of the princes in the Tower? The discovery of the two child skeletons in the Tower of London in 1674, and their subsequent reburial in Westminster Abbey, offers a tantalizing possibility for modern science. If these remains could be exhumed and subjected to advanced forensic analysis, we might finally get some definitive answers. Think about what modern forensic science could tell us. DNA analysis, this is the big one. If viable DNA could be extracted from the bones, it could be compared with known descendants of Edward Iver's family, like present-day members of the British royal family, who are direct descendants of Elizabeth of York, the prince's sister, or the remains of Richard II himself. A DNA match would conclusively prove whether these are indeed the royal princes. This would finally put to rest the 500-year-old question of whether the bones are authentic. Agent sex determination. While initial examinations in 1670 forgave an approximate age, modern osteology, the study of bones, can be far more precise. Forensic anthropologists can determine age at death with remarkable accuracy, confirming if the children were indeed roughly 10 and 12, 13 years old. They can also definitively confirm their sex. 0.3. Cause of death. While difficult with old bones, forensic pathology might be able to find subtle clues of trauma or disease that could indicate how they died. For example, signs of asphyxiation, smothering are unlikely to be preserved, but evidence of violence or long-term illness might. 0.4. Diet and health. Isotope analysis can reveal information about the children's diet and geographical movements during their lives, providing context about their royal upbringing and perhaps even the conditions of their confinement. The prospect is incredibly exciting for historians, scientists, and true crime enthusiasts alike. It offers the tantalizing possibility of closing the book on one of history's most enduring cold cases with irrefutable scientific evidence, rather than relying solely on circumstantial accounts and biased chroniclers. However, there's a massive hurdle, and it's not scientific, but political and ethical. The remains of the presumed princes are interred in Westminster Abbey, a consecrated royal burial site. Any exhumation requires permission from the monarch, King Charles III, in this case in the Dean and Chapter of Westminster Abbey. And historically, this permission has been consistently denied. The reasons for refusal are varied. Some argue for respecting the sanctity of royal graves and avoiding disturbance. Others suggest that even if the bones were identified, it wouldn't truly solve the who did it question, and might simply open up new controversies or put the monarchy in an uncomfortable position by potentially confirming a predecessor's heinous crime. It's a delicate balance between historical curiosity and the solemnity of a royal burial. As one academic stated, the scientific possibility is there, but the political will remain elusive. Here's a curious detail that fuels the scientific desire. When Richard II's remains were found and identified, it was a massive success for forensic archaeology and DNA. That triumph only heightened the calls for the examination of the prince's bones. It proved that such an endeavor is possible and can yield incredible results. If Richard II's DNA could be compared to the prince's, it would be the ultimate family tree verification. So, while modern forensic technology holds the key to definitively identifying the princes in the Tower, and perhaps shedding more light on their fate, that key remains locked away by protocol and historical sensibilities. The scientific breakthrough is ready and waiting, but the access to the evidence is not. The mystery endures, not for a lack of scientific capability, but for a lack of permission to apply it. Until that changes, The bones in Westminster Abbey will continue to hold their secrets, whispering tantalizingly from history, leaving us to wonder what definitive answers they could, and perhaps one day will, reveal. You're almost at the end of our journey into this enduring mystery. But before we wrap up, let's consider what the story of the princes in the tower, this centuries-old cold case, truly leaves us with. It's not just about who did what, but about the lasting impact, the unanswered questions, and the enduring human fascination with historical secrets. Firstly, the princes in the tower symbolize the brutal, often ruthless, nature of power struggles, particularly in medieval monarchies. Their innocence was no shield against political ambition. Their very existence, as legitimate heirs, was a threat that ultimately proved fatal. It's a stark reminder that in the Game of Thrones, even children can be pawns, or worse, obstacles to be removed. It highlights the profound insecurity of life at the top, where familial bonds could be utterly shattered by the pursuit of absolute power. Secondly, this mystery serves as a powerful testament to the elusive nature of historical truth. We've spent centuries dissecting meager evidence, biased accounts, and the propaganda of victors. The lack of a definitive smoking gun, a confession, or irrefutable forensic proof means that the truth is often a matter of interpretation, a consensus rather than a certainty. It forces us to engage critically with sources, to question narratives, and to acknowledge the inherent difficulty of reconstructing past events with perfect accuracy. It's a perpetual reminder that history is rarely as neat and tidy as we'd like it to be. Here's a curious academic reflection on this. Some historians argue that the very fact that the mystery remains unsolved is more historically significant than a definitive answer would be. The uncertainty, the endless re-examination of meager evidence, the competing theories, all of this reveals more about historical interpretation, bias, and the construction of narrative than a simple Richard did it or Henry did it would. The ambiguity itself is the lesson. The enduring popularity is also thanks to its theatricality. The story has all the elements of a classic drama: power struggles, betrayal, innocent victims, a potential villain king, and a desperate search for truth. It has been adapted countless times in books, plays, films, and television, each adaptation breathing new life into the mystery and introducing it to new generations. The visual and narrative power of Shakespeare's Richard II is a prime example of how art can cement a historical story in the public consciousness. Furthermore, the physical location, the Tower of London, plays a significant role. The tower is steeped in history, a place of both royal splendor and dark deeds. Its very stones seem to whisper tales of imprisonment and death. The discovery of the bones within its walls in 1674 only added to its mystique and solidified its association with the lost princes. Visiting the tower today, you can almost feel the weight of centuries of history and the lingering presence of those two young boys. The lack of definitive forensic answers, despite modern technological capabilities, adds to the frustration and the allure. The fact that the British royal family and Westminster Abbey have refused requests to exhume and test the bones means that the mystery remains tantalizingly close, yet definitively out of reach. This barrier only heightens public fascination, turning the story into a kind of forbidden knowledge, an unsolved puzzle guarded by powerful institutions. So, the mystery of the princes in the tower continues to echo through time because it's a perfect storm of human tragedy, historical ambiguity, political intrigue, and compelling narrative. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, legitimacy, and the often brutal nature of history. It's a case that reminds us that sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones that remain forever unsolved, leaving us to endlessly ponder the truth in the silence. As our tale of whispers and shadows draws to a close, let your mind drift gently away from the cold stone walls of the tower and the unresolved questions of centuries past. Feel the soft hum of your fan, the quiet stillness of the night wrapping around you like a comforting blanket. The echoes of history, like faint music, slowly fade. Perhaps In your dreams tonight, you'll find a corner of the past where these mysteries finally unravel. Or perhaps you'll simply find the deepest, most peaceful rest. Let the images and ideas float away like clouds on a summer breeze, leaving only a sense of calm and quiet wonder. Good night, and sweet dreams. The end of the article. Good night.